Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Kansas City veteran jazz clarinetist John Blegen. Over the course of our interview, he discussed his roots that began in Chicago and a move to Philadelphia where he really grew up, and then he got back to Chicago later on before making his way to Kansas City. Over the years, he has survived a heart attack, played with a band in front of Wrigley Field for some time, and he's been in places all over the country, and today he is a part of a thriving Kansas City jazz scene. In 2014, after 7 decades on the planet, he realized his dream of putting out his first solo CD called This and That. And that's exactly what we discussed in a very interesting hour of jazz and stories. Please dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, thank you for taking some time to talk to me today. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to do it.
And thank you for sending the CD This and That. I love it. And your jazz bio is very rich and very full. I'm very excited to talk with you today.
That's an interesting take on it. Okay, I'm glad to hear you say that.
There's been a lot of cities and a lot of action that's gone on. So let's go ahead and start out with what's going on today. Give me kind of a snapshot of what's been going on with you lately.
I came to Kansas City 3 years ago from Chicago, and since then I've got into the Kansas City jazz scene very, very quickly, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But I've been mainly playing with Brom Winans, with the Brom Winans trio at the Majestic, but I also play with a couple of other groups. Kent Rausch, the drummer, has formed a wonderful big band called Vine Street Rumble, and I've subbed with them, but then he formed a smaller group with the same kind of idea, playing Kansas City swing of the 30s and 40s, and it's a 7-piece group. He calls it the Vine Street 7, and I've been playing with them. Unfortunately, we don't. That group does not work a lot, but when it does, it's a lot of fun. There's some wonderful musicians in the group. But it's mainly been with Brom. The trio went to New Hampshire in November to perform at the University of New Hampshire's traditional jazz series, which is a wonderful series. They have 6 concerts a year, and it's not as traditional as it sounds. It's a lot of different kinds of folks have played that series, and it was a great honor to be there and do it. But that's kind of it. I play at the Majestic about 4 times a month, sometimes more than that, various other places, and spend a lot of time trying to keep my chops up. And that's,
right on.
That's about it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. It's been a long career, a long road for you, and your first ever CD was released in 2014, This and That. Talk to me a little bit about this journey to this album, what it means for you.
It was a very long journey, as you can imagine. I'm 73. While I've recorded a couple of times before as a sideman with other groups, and I haven't done a lot of recording. So it's something that I've wanted to do for some time, and my family has been after me to do it for a long time. But the circumstances just never quite came together until I came to Kansas City. And when I got to Kansas City, I discovered that there are these wonderful musicians, Brom and Phil, who I play with in the trio, but also I met Mike Pagan, and I met him at a jam session that he led for a while at a restaurant called Puropo's in Briarcliff, north of the city. Got to know Mike a little bit, and I thought he would be a good person to be on it. I met the wonderful bassist Bob Bowman, who is a world-class player and has played with everybody, including the Fat Jones Mel Lewis band. I had been listening to Bob Bowman on records for quite a while because he recorded a lot with the singer Karen Allison, who I loved to listen to long before I even knew I was coming to Kansas City. So I got to know Bob a little bit, and I invited him to play on the CD, and Mike Pagan helped me a lot. First of all, to identify a good recording studio and a great engineer, Mike Moreland. The confluence of a lot of different factors, meeting some new musicians who were just wonderful and very friendly and wanted to help me out with this. And so I was able to pull it all together. And I also had some help from some family. My wife really was the producer on the album, and she helped a great deal. My son Aaron did the cover photograph. So it was a family effort as well, and it's a great moment for me. I'm glad I finally got it done, and it's fun to be able to have it now and think about what's coming next.
Yeah, it's a great album. Yeah, it is a great story. Let's get to the beginnings of your story, though. You were born in Chicago, raised in Philadelphia. Talk to me about how your childhood led to this love of jazz for you.
My parents were musical. My mother was a piano teacher, and my father sang, but they were more interested in classical music than jazz. I heard a little bit of jazz in the home growing up on the radio. I liked what I heard, but I didn't know quite what that was. And when I started to learn music, it was as a violinist. I started on the violin when I was 9 years old and played for 6 years. And when my parents moved to a school district that had no orchestra, I switched to the clarinet. I'd actually wanted to switch to a wind instrument for some time because I was getting a little tired of having fights on the way home carrying my violin case. So I switched to clarinet, and within 2 years I was playing some gigs, and I picked up saxophones on the way. I played in the high school swing band, and I formed a Dixieland band. Dixieland bands in the mid-'50s were not all that uncommon among young people. The Dixieland revival was still kind of going on, but at a sort of reduced pace, but it was sort of the thing to do for, there was rock and roll, of course, that was beginning at that point, but Dixieland jazz was there. My dad would bring me home a record because it had a clarinet player on the front, not knowing quite what it was. And so that's how I learned who Pete Fountain was and who Benny Goodman was, and began to listen to those people. And there was a wonderful jazz station, an FM station in Philadelphia at the time, WHAT-FM, that I listened to and began to learn a lot. And I can still remember hearing about the death of Billie Holiday. One of the disc jockeys on that show broke into the program and announced that he had just heard that Billie Holiday had died. So, that was sort of my introduction. I got to hear Louis Armstrong when I was still in high school. He came to a dance hall nearby, and I borrowed my father's car and took a girlfriend who I hoped to impress, and we went to see Pops, and it was absolutely wonderful. It was a wonderful band, and it was the All-Stars with Barrett Deems on drums and Edmund Hall on clarinet, and really my favorite version of that band. Many, many years later on, when I was 50 years old, in fact, on my 50th birthday, I had a gig with Barrett Deems, which was sort of was the full circle of my musical. Yeah, it was when I was living in Chicago, and Barrett was still playing there, and he called me for a gig, and it was a marvelous experience.
That is a huge circle right there. Let me ask you this: when you were a kid, did you dream about being a musician, or were there other aspirations that you had?
Well, I did, but I got some static from my parents about from at home. They felt that it wasn't a profession that I really should be pursuing, and I got a lot of resistance from them. But I was gigging when I was in high school, and I was already making some money, and so it sounded pretty good to me. And I was also interested in the sciences and so on. So I caved into my parents. I'm embarrassed to say, and went to college with the idea that I would be a chemical engineer. But I had my revenge on them because I ended up being a Frenchman. Which was just as perilous economically as being a musician. And I went on to grad school in French, and that was a time when I sort of drifted away from music a little bit. I still played on the side now and then, but when I was finishing my degree in grad school and beginning to teach French at the State University of New York at Vance, and I kind of let the horns go, and I didn't practice that much, and but I felt a terrible lack of the music gone, and at first I sort of didn't notice it, but my wife at that time did notice it, that I was getting a little bit nuts because I wasn't playing. And one night we went to a concert on campus that was done by the Campus Jazz Workshop Band, and the guest artist was Clark Terry. And I sat in the audience and watched that band and listened to Clark's wonderful sound. And I thought, man, I could do that. I could be up there and play in that band. And I went back to my house and I got my horn out, and I realized that no, I couldn't do that. That I needed to do some woodshedding and practicing. So I did, and I spent the summer really working on the horn, on tenor and on clarinet, and auditioned for the Jazz Workshop Band. They allowed faculty to play as well as students, and made the band. And I played with them for a couple of years, and it was a wonderful experience because people like Marvin Stamm and Eddie Daniels and Frank West would come up from New York and spend 3 days with us and then do a concert with us. And I got to meet those gentlemen. I got to trade fours with Frank West and things like that. And it was an absolutely wonderful thing, and it got me back in music again. Playing ever since. So.
Perfect. Well, and then you started playing, as you kind of touched on, professionally at 16 in a Dixieland band and a big band composed of Drexel Tech students. Talk to me about your first go at being on stage. Were you nervous? Did it feel comfortable? What was it like?
It's so long ago. I don't think I can remember. But yeah, I'm sure I would. I'm sure I was nervous. I did a little performance when I was in high school with classical things. I played the Mozart Clarinet Concerto for my high school graduation, and I remember being very nervous for that. With jazz, the nerves began to go away because I was making it up as I went along. So who could tell whether I was playing a low note? I began to get a little more confidence about that. The more I played with bands, the less nervousness I felt. Don't feel that anymore at all. Yeah, it was when I first got up to play improvised solos. It was a very unnerving kind of situation, and in those days, there were no jazz programs and there were no improvisation methods. And you kind of listened to records and tried to copy what was going on and listen to the people that you liked and you tried to copy that, but also tried to play something that was uniquely your own. I loved the clarinet playing of Edmund Hall. I loved Benny Goodman, and those are two opposite poles, really. Not as opposite as the difference between Goodman and Pee Wee Russell. But so I would listen to all kinds of different players and love them, and sometimes try to incorporate some of what they did. But I was basically just trying to do my own thing and come up with my own approach to it. The more I did that, I think the less nervous I got and began to really, and now I just enjoy being up on stage. I really enjoy playing with other guys, and it's that kind of communication that happens in a group is a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. Well, and you've also toured. In the summers of 61 and 62, you went to Europe with the band from Williams College. What was it like to be in a different, environment like Europe? They respond to jazz a little bit differently. And just for you to broaden your horizons, what was that like?
Well, it was a great, eye-opening experience. It was a marvelous thing. Those 2 summers were just amazing times in my life when I became aware of all kinds of things that I wasn't aware of before, and that was really the reason that I ended up being a French major in college, specializing in French literature. We spent a lot of time in France, and I really loved the people and the culture that I saw there. The reception that we had from European audiences was just wonderful. I mean, it was extremely warm. And we met a number of American expatriate jazz musicians who were there. We ran into Kenny Drew and his drummer at the time, Larry Ritchie. They stayed at the same hotel we did in Paris, and we got to know them a little bit. It was a marvelous experience. The second summer, we had a month engagement at a club in Frankfurt where we played 7 nights a week. And by the time we finished that, the band was just unbelievably tight, and it was really a terrific time. That band had some great players in it. One was Jeff Haskell, who was our bass player, but he also played piano and sang. And Jeff later became the head of the jazz program at the University of Arizona, and is now retired. But he had a great career. He was did a lot of arranging and conducting, and I think he was the arranger for a number of Linda Ronstadt albums and things like that. But Jeff is a terrific guy, and he's still playing and performing out in Tucson. But the rest of the guys, like me, went off and did other things, but they all still played. And a year ago, we had a reunion in Tucson when Jeff was retiring. All 6 of us were able to make it, and we all still play. And it was an absolutely wonderful experience.
Yeah, that had to be, for sure. So you played in the mid-'60s with various Jersey and Philadelphia groups, and in the '70s, you played actually with Irby Green, Frank West, Eddie Daniels, a lot of luminaries like that. What was it like in the '60s and '70s as you kind of started gaining more exposure and playing with more people?
It began to open up a lot of areas to me that and I think one of the things that it showed me was that I had a lot to learn. The times of playing with Irby Green and Eddie Daniels and Frank West and so on were when I was with that jazz workshop band at State University of New York at Binghamton. It was led by a gentleman named Al Hom, who retired a couple of years ago, but also was he was the mentor to a lot of young musicians who later became quite prominent, like Sherry Miracle who started Diva, and Al did a lot to encourage me to get more serious about what I was doing and understand what I was trying to do. One of the things I learned was that what I was really best at was playing an older style, and since I had day jobs that had other requirements on my time, basically what I did was to stick with that and try to be the best traditional clarinetist and saxophonist that I could be, rather than to go very deeply into bebop. So I'm really still pretty much a period player and a pre-bebop player, although occasionally, since I love that music and listen to it a lot and have played with a lot of bebop players, it creeps into what I'm doing. So I'm not a pure period player. I realized that I better stick with the older stuff. One of my feelings is that I think in jazz programs it would be great if there was more emphasis on listening to and learning the older stuff, because that's where a lot of ideas and lyricism comes from. And one thing I really like about Kansas City is there's a great consciousness here of what went before. A lot of the younger players who were coming out of UMKC and programs like Ottawa really have a pretty good idea of what Kansas City jazz was in the 30s, and they can play the music if needed, and that's really marvelous, and it's been great to see.
We're going to kind of flash forward a little bit from the 60s and 70s. You come back to the Chicago area in 1989. What was it like to kind of come back to a home for you and to jump back into that scene?
Well, of course, I had left Chicago when I was 13 months old, so I didn't really remember a lot about Chicago. I knew street names because my parents had grown up there and would talk about Devon Avenue and would talk about Western Avenue and so on. And I knew these street names and sort of generally, but I didn't know Chicago very well. And so it was kind of neat to go back because it was a completely new discovery. But it took me a long time to break into the music scene. There was a band playing in a little restaurant. I had a job. I was the director of a library in suburban Chicago called Glenview. And there was a little bar there called the Railroad Inn where a band played every Wednesday night, so I would go over and sit in. It was a great band, and they were very welcoming, and they always had me sit in. And they usually would have, when people came to sit in, they'd usually play a couple of tunes. And in my case, they would say, stay with us, and I would play the rest of the night. And it began to dawn on me that these guys were getting a free clarinet player, but no gigs were coming out of this, and so it was going on for quite a while. And then one day there was a saxophone player in the group named Kim Cusack, who was also a clarinetist, and he asked me if I liked baseball. And I said, yeah, I love baseball. And he said, have I got a job for you? And it turned out that he was the regular clarinet player in the Chicago Cubs Dixieland Band, which plays outside the stadium, outside Wrigley Field, and then plays during the game whenever the third out is recorded. They play it for a while, and then they move on about 100 feet in the stands and do the same thing when the next half inning is over. And the band's been there since the 1980s. Kim had played with him for quite a while, but he often needed a substitute. So I began to substitute in the Cubs band, and I met the other players in the Cubs band at the time were a really, really good bunch of guys. One of them was a wonderful trombonist, Russ Phillips. And Russ began to tell people about me, and I started getting calls and began to work a lot. And he gradually began to play with a lot of really fine Chicago musicians, including the wonderful bass player Eddie DeHaas, who had come to, Eddie was originally from Indonesia, but grew up in Europe and Holland, and then played with Chet Baker and other folks like that, and then emigrated to the United States in the 50s. And he was just playing a gig with him was an education. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. And so I played with him and with a number of other fine players, including Russ Phillips, and had a lot of different kinds of gigs, and ended up playing pretty steadily with the band, Chicago-style jazz band called Jim Clark's Jazz People. Jim Clark was a trumpet player who had once worked with Earl Father Hines, and so it was quite an education. There were great players in Chicago, and there was a wonderful swing clarinetist named Chuck Hedges who played every Monday night at Andy's Jazz Club in the River North area downtown, and I got to listen to him a bit. And when I got the gig with Barrett Deems, I met Chuck. He was at the same festival that Barrett's band played, and I got to know Chuck a little bit. And after a while, he heard me play, and he began to call me to substitute for him now and then. When he did hear me play, he would usually give me a little critique. It wasn't gentle. It was usually pretty harsh. He would yell at me and tell me that I wasn't practicing, which was really pretty true, because I had a pretty absorbing day job, and I would try to get my practicing in as much as possible every day, but it was really hard. And finally, I retired from the library in 2002 and really began to woodshed again, and Chuck was quite a cheerleader and a great mentor, and really got me going. And then in 2005, he became very ill, and he needed to have surgery. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and when he went in for surgery, I would drive up to Milwaukee to play with his Milwaukee band. He lived in Milwaukee, but often played in Chicago. And when he managed to survive 5 years after his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, which is really incredible. But he finally died in 2010, and before he passed away, he told his band members in Milwaukee that they should hire me to replace him, and that was a tremendous honor. One of the tunes that I have on the album is a tune that I wrote as a tribute to Chuck. He just did so much for me and was such a great inspiration. and an absolutely wonderful player. That was the Chicago and Milwaukee experience, and it was a wonderful time for me.
I'm going to kind of continue this health part of what you were talking about. In 2012, you suffered a serious heart attack. Talk to me about how that changed your outlook on life.
It was the heart attack that they call the widowmaker. It was a complete blockage of one of my arteries. My wife was very quick, called 911, and the emergency people were unbelievably fast. This happened in Evanston. And between the time they got me to the ER and the time they got the angioplasty and the stent in me was 35 minutes.
Wow.
It was just amazing. And they did an absolutely wonderful job, and I was very fortunate because I actually my heart did stop, and they had to give me 6 shocks with the paddles to get me going again. But once they got the blockage cleared, everything looked good, and I did a rehab after that, and I've since been in very good shape. But the lesson was this is not a permanent situation, and every day is a gift, and I believe that, and I've been trying to live like that ever since, and take advantage of the extra time that I've been given. It inspired me to work a lot harder on my music, and to really pay attention to a lot of the relationships that I have, and it was a tremendous wake-up call. I had been in pretty good health. There were no warning signs. I was a little tad overweight, but not much. I'd been to see a doctor 2 weeks before it, and he said that I looked fine, and we were thinking about maybe that I would start with some statins because my cholesterol was a little high, but it didn't look bad. And then, bam! 2 weeks later, I almost checked out, and it has been ever since just such a gift to be here. And now that I've come to Kansas City to play with these marvelous guys and to continue doing my music and learning more, and to continue to learn more and develop more has just been a marvelous gift, and continues to be that.
Right on. What brought you to Kansas City?
Well, my wife is from here. She's my second wife. My first one passed away in 2000. And Alice, my current wife, and I met in Chicago in 2003. And she had come to Chicago from Dallas to take a job there, but she was originally from Kansas City. And so after we got married, we would come here and visit. One day on a very nice fall day, she said, you really shouldn't bring me here when the weather's this nice because I'll want to come back. And I said, really? Do you want to come back? And she said, yeah, but, you've got your music situation in Chicago and you don't want to leave that. And I said, well, can I have a dog? And so we made a deal, and I got the dog, and we moved to Kansas City. And I have 2 sons, and they're on either coast, so it really made geographical sense to be more in the middle than I was. We had seen a little bit of the Kansas City jazz scene when we had visited, and my wife's brother, my wife had a brother who passed away about 15 years ago, named Mike Maggi, who was a drummer, and he was a very good drummer, and he had played with a lot of folks. And my wife has another brother who was a Methodist minister in Clinton and is just retired, but knows a lot of the people that Mike Maggi knew, and so there was a possibility that they could make some connections for me when I got here. But actually, it all happened in a very, very easy and marvelous way. When I was getting ready to leave Chicago, a friend of mine, a wonderful drummer who has since passed away, named Rusty Jones, heard about my plans to go to Kansas City. And Rusty was a marvelous, marvelous drummer. He toured with George Shearing for 6 years, and he played with everybody who came through Chicago. He was kind of the first call drummer when somebody from out of town would need a rhythm section. I was lucky enough to play with him several times, and he was such a lovely man and a really nice person. And he heard that I was going to Kansas City, so he called his friend Tommy Ruskin in Kansas City. Tommy, a wonderful drummer who also, unfortunately, has passed away recently. Anyway, he called Tommy and he said, "Blegen's coming to Kansas City. Be nice to him." And so after I got here, I was here about a month or so, and I called Tommy, and Tommy said, "Well, come on down to the Majestic where I have a gig and sit in." So I did, and 2 days later, I got a call from Don that he wanted to hire me. It was just that quick. It happened very fast and was great, and I had the marvelous gift to be able to play with Tommy for about a little over a year before he passed away. That was just a wonderful experience. Tommy was absolutely a world-class drummer with a marvelous feel, absolutely great time and great imagination. And he was a lovely man. He would say things to me like, you ought to play such and such a tune. You'd sound good on that, and that kind of thing. He was always very encouraging and very helpful. And so it was a real treat to be able to work with him for the time that he was able to stay with us.
Yeah, that had to be a great learning experience. So you obviously traveled around. You're what probably the Kansas City jazz community would say is vested here in Kansas City. So I want to ask you this. What's so great about the Kansas City jazz scene for you?
I think the fact that the musicians like each other. There's a tremendous amount of community here among musicians, and they're very welcoming. If you go into a place, the chances of being asked to sit in are very, very high. And people who play the same instrument help each other find gigs and find opportunities and that sort of thing. There's a lot of fraternal feeling among the musicians in town, and it's very different in that sense from Chicago. I felt that kind of thing was present to a small degree in some areas, but not the way it is here in Kansas City. It's been a marvelously welcoming community. There's a lot of talent here. The players are very, very fine players, and there's a lot of interesting writing and experimenting going on. The 627 big band that plays at the Green Lady is a real interesting group with a lot of input from younger people. The young players that I've met have been extraordinary. I've gotten to know and play with every once in a while people like Steve Lambert and Brett Jackson, who are just marvelous saxophone players. That's been a real eye-opener for me. I think that the UMKC Conservatory has done a really great job of turning out great people, and of course there are other good programs around too. Jim Mayer at Kansas City, Kansas Community College has a marvelous program, and he's enlisted a lot of great local players and instructors. I've played a couple gigs with Jim, and that's been a great learning experience for me too. It's a very vibrant and lively scene. It's a little bit, it's sad to see some clubs come and go, like the Broadway Jazz Club. I played there a couple times, and I was sorry to see that disappear. There are a lot of venues that will, they're not completely devoted to jazz, but they do have jazz groups now and then, and that's been great. So I think it's a scene that can support musicians. I think we've all got to keep working at it and getting the word around and getting people out and filling the seats. But but it's just a very vibrant scene. My wife and I went to the Jay McShann celebration at the Gem several weeks ago, and of course there was the marvelous pianist Benny Green who came in, but everyone else was Kansas City. The musicianship was absolutely extraordinary. It was a really splendid evening, and that kind of thing can happen very easily here. There are really great players in town, and there are opportunities for them to play. So it's a great scene.
What has been the most interesting thing to you about the lore of Kansas City, from Charlie Parker, 18 and Vine, Count Basie? What has been intriguing to you about our history?
When I was a kid in high school, I loved the Basie band, and so I tried to learn as much about where that band came from. Of course, it was not the Kansas City Basie band. It was the Basie band of the 50s with people like Thad Jones in the trumpet section, and Henry Coker in the trombone section, and Marshall Royal and Frank West and Frank Foster and Charlie Fulks in the saxophone section. So it was a different band, but the concept of swing and the way the Basie rhythm section worked was something that went all the way back to Kansas City. And the more I learned about that band, the more interested I became in learning more about the history. And I actually had read the book about Kansas City jazz that Chuck Haddix co-wrote before I came here, before I knew I was coming here. So I was interested in how Kansas City jazz had developed from the 20s, and of course there was the tremendous wide open club situation that was fostered by the Pendergast regime.
Yeah, that helps.
But then you had the territory bands coming in, and the Blue Devils and so on coming in, Andy Kurt's band, all coming here and forming this unbelievable stew of jazz development that happened during the early 30s and mid 30s. And of course, Charlie Parker came out of that as a person who was very much influenced by it, and then went his own way. It was great to come here, and in fact, the very first time we came on a visit, we went to the Jazz Museum and looked around, and I had said to my wife, I want to go over to 18th and Vine. I want to see what's going on over there. I want to see what's happened. It's a tremendous history, and it's so meaningful to jazz because the whole feeling of swing came from here. And I think Bobby Watson is absolutely correct when he says that jazz was born in New Orleans and grew up in Kansas City. I agree with that. I think that's a very accurate statement.
Absolutely.
Because the feel of the rhythm section that became the heart of that wonderful Basie band that I loved in the 50s. This is where it all happened. This is where it came together.
Yep, absolutely. Let me ask you this. As a man that has dedicated his life to jazz, why do you love jazz?
The fact that it's a language. It's an improvised language, and it has such wonderful potential for expression, for individual expression, and for group expression. And it's a basis of communication. And then there are the intangibles. I mean, when a band is swinging and I'm listening to them or I'm playing with them, it's such a marvelous feeling. There's almost nothing like it. I mean, it's a great feeling of joy. It's a wonderful thing to be alive too. I played classical music a little bit when I was coming up, and I respect classical players tremendously. The dedication they have and the amount of time that they have to put in, and the subtlety with which they approach the music. There's nothing like getting up and playing over changes and making something up that just wasn't there before. That's just such a unique thing and such a wonderful thing. I guess that's an answer. I hope that's an answer.
It is, totally is. And as I had mentioned in an email to you, and I genuinely believe this, I think the clarinet in a jazz setting is one of the happiest sounds around. How would you, what do you like the best about the clarinet?
it's a love-hate relationship. First of all, Joe, I need to say that. I mean, I think it was Paquito de Rivera says that the clarinet was invented by 5 guys who didn't know each other. It's a difficult instrument. It's not as difficult as the violin or some other instruments, but it's tricky. And it can be unforgiving. I still squeak now and then, mainly because when you're playing jazz, you're trying for something that you may not have done before, and so things can go wrong. It can be a wonderful sound. There are as many clarinet sounds as there are clarinet players. Everybody has a slightly different sound, and that you can go all the way from Pee Wee Russell and his strange sound to the purity of an Eddie Daniels or a Buddy DeFranco or Will Goodman. There's such a wide range of what can be done with the instrument. And there are some young players now who are doing some marvelous things. Anat Cohen is just a marvelous clarinetist, and my wife and I were lucky enough to catch her when she was in Kansas City a couple of years ago at the Folly, and she's just amazing, and is doing great things with it. And there's a Norwegian clarinetist whose name escapes me right now. A young man, I think he's only in his 20s, who's an extraordinary technician and swings pretty hard too. So I'm hoping that people like Anat and this young fellow from Norway will help keep the instrument alive. There's a very active group of people who are interested in clarinet. There's an international association that I've been a member of for some time. So I'm hoping that it will continue to play a role. When I was coming up in jazz, clarinet was dropping out of jazz as a viable instrument because the saxophone was becoming the main lead voice, and there were very few performers outside of the traditional jazz performers who were playing clarinet. But I think people like Eddie Daniels kept the faith and kept it going, and so it's great that that's still happening.
Let me ask you this, my final question for you. You've had a very interesting life. You released your first CD after almost 7 decades on planet Earth. You've survived a heart attack. You sound like you're a survivor, and you're going after the jazz dream continually. What would you like your legacy to be?
Well, if anybody thinks about me at all, I hope they realize that I didn't give up. I kept at it.
I'd say so.
I hope that I've inspired some younger players to keep at it. I think that as I played various places over the years, there have been people who have really enjoyed it and gotten a kick out of it, and that's great, and that's why we do this. You know, I hope that I have no illusions about the significance of my CD. It's just an artifact of what I've been up to for these 7 decades, as you put it. It's not breaking any new ground, but I think that it's an enjoyable thing, and I hope that I've had a number of people say that they enjoy it, and I hope they do. Of course, the most important thing for me was that my kids have been yelling at me to do this for so many years that I finally had something that I can say, okay, well, here it is.
Yeah. Dream realized. Perfect. Hey, John, thank you for giving me your story and giving me some time today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, Chicago, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to John for his contribution to the thriving KC jazz scene and that spirit that shines in him. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or you can visit the neonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.